Good morning, everybody. All right. Congratulations, you've made it. It's the last day and you persisted. That's amazing, you showed up. I feel like I have to lower expectations a little bit. What Kurt presented there right now are all things that my team did. We have a team, we have a lab. Obviously, a one-man show can only do so much. So today we're going to talk about personalized learning with generative AI. And I know generative AI is on everybody's mind, personalized learning is on everybody's mind. So I thought I'd bring this together and try and offer a new perspective. But before we do that, I do most of my work in the context of CREATE, which is a lab I direct at New York University, where our mission is to invent, design, and study the future of learning. And as part of the Games for Learning Institute that I co-founded in 2008 with Ken Perlin, a computer scientist, and that was initially supported by Microsoft Research, where we asked the question, what can make games effective for learning and how can we learn with games? Today, though, I want to talk about a number of topics that, as I mentioned, have become very popular. And I want to start with asking what is AI, and then what is personalization. Talk about the adaptation cycle, and then bring it all together with generative AI and personalization of learning. However, because it's you, I don't think we need to talk much about what is AI, because you're a group that already has done that. So I want to start with some sample projects. And just to give you context where I'm coming from when I talk about all these things. Work we've done in CREATE. Very early on, we worked with Stephen Hawking on a project on his public lecture on life in the universe, where we visualized the content so people could explore it. We worked with the New York Hall of Science in Queens, New York on this exhibit, that's the Connected Worlds exhibit, where you can explore the water cycle intergenerationally using a Kinect-based interaction system. We built games for a grant to train executive functions. This is called Guacamole, this is called All You Can Eat Tea, and this is called Crush Stations. And if you're interested, they're all available in the App Store and Google Play for free. And they're actually research-supported ways of training inhibitory control, shifting, and working memory. We also built games to teach about AI. This is a game that was designed with the primarily Chinese market in mind, called Zodiac. And we built a lot of virtual reality, two virtual reality environments. This one on cell biology, this is called Looking Inside Cells. And this one on Cosmos, that's called Cosmos VR, where we wanted to see how we can leverage the affordances of VR to support learning. We've done some of the work and applied that with projects like this one with Syrian refugees in Turkey, with support of Başakşehir University in Turkey. And we've worked with Games for Learning and digital play with the LEGO Foundation to study how 8 to 12-year-olds digital play affects their well-being, and designed a whole well-being framework around that with partners at different universities in Sheffield and in Australia, and with UNICEF Innocenti involved. And if you're interested in the report, that's available, and I can also share that later. So those are some of the projects, and when I talk about personalizing learning, when I talk about generative AI, I think about projects like that. So let's start with what is generative AI. And since you're all looking so attentively, I want to start with asking you. Let's hear from you, and if you want to use your phones to scan this barcode, this QR code, you should get a not yet activated poll with the eLearn logo. Yes, okay. So let me switch to that. I'm going to activate that to show you the first question, which is, how often do you use generative AI? Never, once a month, once a week, once a day. All the time means I'm on it right now, trying to find the answer to this question. Now let's have a look. Okay. Let me switch back to the instructions again. And all right, let's have a look at the responses. So we have almost 50% saying once a day, 40% saying all the time, 14% saying once a week. It's interesting, social desirability bias now prevents us from saying we don't use it at all, right? Who can fess up to not using AI nowadays? Interesting dilemma. So thank you for responding. I'm going to give you 3 more seconds if you haven't pushed the button yet to fess up which one is you. And now we're going to move on to my next question for you. What do you use generative AI for? Here you can just answer, ideally a 1-word phrase, but if you must, you can use multiple words. What do you use AI for? Meaning, use it for a lot of things. Use the one, what's your primary use of AI? Same QR code, don't have to scan again. All right, we see a number of different uses, just like we would expect. Searching, thinking, writing, paraphrasing, speakers, discussions, brainstorming. Research emerges, shockingly, at a conference that's about research. That's awesome. Yeah, so research, ideas, advice, brainstorming, paraphrasing are kind of the central pieces here that we're getting. I'm going to let you continue working on this, and we can later, I'm going to send in a report that we can share, so feel free to keep working on this. I want to keep going with my presentation, and we'll have more chances to share later. What's AI? It's really the intelligence of machines or software, where the idea is that it's opposed to the intelligence of us as human beings. And the ability of a computer or robot to perform tasks like humans do, reasoning, learning, problem solving. What we're facing currently is narrow AI. And I added the HAL 9000 as an audience check. I used to mention this movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, to my students all the time. In the beginning when I taught, 90% were like, yeah, that was a good movie. By now we're probably about 10–15% who still remember what it is. But we don't currently have artificial general intelligence as far as we know. Does it exist in a government lab? We don't know, but we currently are dealing with narrow or weak AI. And that is what performs a single task very well. Now you would say GPT performs a lot of tasks, but it's a single task of comprehending language and giving language output, right? So we are there. We're not yet at the AGI stage, and when that happens, lots of things could happen that we don't really know about. But currently we're dealing with narrow AI. And when it comes to ChatGPT, this was supposed to build up layer by layer, but here we are. We have, within narrow AI, we have machine learning. Within that, we have generative AI. Within that, we have large language models, then conversational agents, and GPT is one of them, right? So we're dealing, when it comes to conversational agents even, to a relatively small sliver of what AI is. And when we look at what AI really is, then we realize it's a lot of different tools. So the first thing that I want to recognize is that, and this is not from me, I have the source quoted down there. The first thing that what I want to recognize is AI is a lot of different things. When you look at what it does, machine vision, robotics, expert systems, speech, NLP, machine learning, are all different forms of AI. I have colleagues who've worked in the space for a long time get a paper almost rejected because they were using computer vision, and the reviewer said, that's not AI, which is kind of funny, because now we think generative AI is the only AI that's worth looking at. So how do large language models work? I'm also not going to go into a lot of detail with that because I'm going to assume you know that. But we do know that we're training an LLM based on a large corpus of data that we're then somehow using model design and transformer for the model training, and then the evaluation and fine-tuning that happens with reinforcement learning from human feedback, etc. Those methods are constantly being refined and changed, but the overall idea is I need a large corpus of data so that I can eventually have my large language model. And I can see that there are many, many different types of models that are publicly available, many more are not publicly available. And what they're trained on differs, right? There are some that are completely trained on web pages, that's the top left. There are others that are completely trained on code. And then there are lots that are hybrids. And where does all of this information come from? Many lawsuits allege that it comes from different places that didn't give the IPs. Here we see the size that we're dealing with. GPT-4 Classic is in the kind of tens of billion of parameters. Now with the larger system, we're in the hundreds of billions of parameters. So the amount of information that's being ingested by a large language model has been growing. Though recently we weren't all that impressed with the latest jump from let's say, GPT-4 to 5, even though it is a huge jump in the parameters that it has. So what we're dealing with then is prompt engineering, something that I use to communicate with an LLM, a description of how I like to solve a certain problem. And the LLM describes the words that it has, the information that it has ingested as word vectors in form of word space. Now this is a fake, obviously, because the space that these vectors create can't be visualized. Here we're looking at 3 dimensions. A word vector in an LLM looks a little bit more like this, between 100 and thousands of the length of it. And so vector in space is kind of a space that we will never be able to imagine. However, it comes with very interesting things. So in that space, we can't imagine what's close to one another, and information is also some things that relate, which is how we got language translations and so on. We then use transformers, and this is the part that I wanted to get to determine the meaning of each word in context. And the transformers here, I show 2 different layers. There are there are many, many more layers that we're going through, where if I have a sentence like John wants his bank to cash the check, or cash the actually, one layer might identify that wants is a verb and cash is a verb, and then the next layer might actually identify that his refers to John's and bank refers not to something you can sit on by the financial institution. And that's the magic of the transformer layers, and guess what? No engineer, even the ones who built those systems, can tell you in what transformer layer what happens. We're going back to GPT-1 and 2 to try and figure it out, and even that is difficult. So we're dealing with a system we don't fully understand how it does what it does. We know how it's built, but we don't quite know how it does what it does. And that has consequences. So when we ask an LLM any information, the transformers predict the most probable next word. So if my sentence is Houston, I have A, I get probabilities. I get probabilities of that the outcome could be rocket, which would be very reasonable. Houston, I have a rocket. But much more likely, much more common is Houston, I have a problem. So depending on the heat of the transformer or of your model itself, I will get one or the other. I will get a more random approach or response, or the more common response. Why does all of this matter? Because anybody who has dealt with probabilities realizes probabilities can work out for you or they cannot work out for you. So in the end, when I give DALL-E a prompt that says a doctor with long blonde hair treating a patient, for a moment think about what that could be, a doctor with a long blonde hair treating a patient. We get this. These are older ones. I think this has now been improved, but we see clear bias in that. A professor with long curly hair giving a lecture to older educators. I get this. Well, you see a clear bias in here. They're all mostly men, not all men. They're mostly white. And we could say, how can these systems be so biased? This is unbelievable. A blonde woman, this is my favorite one, blonde woman in a pink car driving with a man in the back seat. There she is, with the man in the back seat. At least she has a glass of rosé. That's good. But it's very clear that we have biased output based on input here. This is another one with Midjourney. My favorite part is that he turns her back to her. So that's the back seat kind of part, or he's all the way behind the car. But we can't get the man into the back seat. Now, why is all of that? It's not because the system is biased. It's because the corpus of data it pulled from is biased. And guess what that means? We're biased. We have all different kind of stereotypes, and that's the information that it took from the web, from books, from other sources, from conversations. So anytime I hear people bitterly complaining about how biased LLMs are, I'm thinking, have you really thought through where the bias comes from? Because it's just a big mirror hanging on the wall, and we stare into it, and what we get out of it is exactly what went in. So now they're trying to correct all of that, which of course is important. But there are many AI examples. You have used many of them for making charts, visualizing data, using code, and so on. I don't want to go into much detail about that because you've used them and there's a community around it. So that was my brief journey of what AI is, speaking, I'm presuming, to the converted who already have used it and know about it. So I want to talk about something else, what's personalization of learning. And personalization of learning, I wanted to start with asking you. And I'm going to advance this, hopefully, to the next activity. which is, have you experienced a personalized learning environment? Are you seeing the question? Yes, good. Either no or yes in face-to-face instruction, or yes in an ITS, a digital game, virtual reality, or in another system. Have you experienced something that truly felt personalized? Let's have a look at some of the responses here. All right, about a third have said they haven't. All right, there are some ITS users, other digital systems. There are learning management systems now that personalize in VR, 4%. In a digital game. But about a third of you have not experienced it. And then the other 2/3 in various forms. So thank you for that. My next question around that is, what was that experience like in one word? When you had that personalized learning experience. Now, of course, the third that said they didn't have it, I'm sorry. You can just leave that blank. So for those who did say yes to one of the different uses, tell me what your experience was like. Reflective experience, special, personalized, contextualized, assistance, excited, limited, customized, authentic, affirmed, creative. I see people are liking authentic, which is great. And hand-holding, authentic hand-holding. Very nice. Frustrating, we see. Stunning, okay. All right, I'm gonna switch out of this again to keep going here. If you'd like to add more, please feel free. We typically talk about personalization in very broad terms when we accommodate a particular learner's need, whatever that might be. And it can happen at different levels. It can happen at a macro level. That's when we personalize at a group level. For instance, I select a certain course, or the system recommends I take a certain course. It can happen at a meso level, when I have certain learner characteristics. I might choose to take a certain class as a prerequisite, or I might have a certain module within the class. And then what we're interested in is the micro level. That happens based on the interaction with the game, with the system that I'm currently learning with. So game should actually be replaced by system, learning system. And there are a number of different questions to ask. And I want to not go into this, oh, let's use a chat agent to personalize. I want to go into how does it actually work? And there are three major questions that we need to ask. What variable should we adapt for? How can we measure this variable? And how do we adapt for this variable? And this goes back to Bell-Schutz's work. So what variable should the system adapt for? Now think about the one that you may have used. 2/3 of you said they had. What is a variable that is worth adapting for? When you look at intelligent tutoring systems, you see it's mostly cognitive variables, your current knowledge, your current skills. And then the system says, okay, you know this, and now you get the next thing, right? We could adapt for cognitive development, language proficiency, learning strategies, cognitive abilities like executive functions and others, cognitive load, self-regulation, but we largely don't, even within the cognitive domain. But guess what? I left a lot of space on this slide. Why? Because there are other domains. What about motivational variables? Do we ever personalize on a motivational level? We sometimes do, but when it comes to individual interest, that's something when a good teacher knows to make something interest-driven. Situational interest, do I actually like the activity that I do? Goal orientation, theory of intelligence, self-efficacy, stereotype, threat, persistence. All of those are variables just on a motivational level that I could adapt for, but we typically don't. Affective variables, one of my favorites, your emotional state. There is some work done by AutoTutor was actually turned into a tutor that was able to respond to frustration and boredom, and that's Sidney DeMello's work. But often we don't do that either. What is your state of appraisal of what you're doing, your emotional regulation skills, and your attitudes and your emotional development? Very little is happening on this space for adaptation as a basis for adaptation. And then, of course, social-cultural variables. And here we have sometimes culturally responsive approaches, and when people said authentic, that was probably what they were talking about. But again, rarely do we adopt for social context, cultural context, for your identity of self-perception, relatedness, social agency, or social development, all of those are still wide open as potential, what we call source variables for adaptations. Right? So my first call is to say, if you find yourself in a position of advising on building a new personalized system or building one yourself, think beyond just prior or current knowledge or skills and think about what other variables we can adapt for. So what are considerations? First of all, we need to know if that variable is actually relevant for learning outcomes. That would be helpful, because if it's not, why do it? Then is there enough learner variability on it, right, to justify the need for individualized interaction? Maybe everybody is frustrated. Then I don't need to personalize, then I just need to fix what they get frustrated about. Or is there sufficient knowledge on how to adapt to learner differences along this variable? And that's when we're getting in real trouble, and I'll follow up with that in a moment. Do we actually know, if we knew the state of the learner, what to do? So how can we measure these variables? There are many different ways currently to do it. We often use self-reports. We use observations, biometrics, learning analytics. I don't want to get into too much detail, but there are methods. Most of them are not where we want them to be, certainly not in real time. How can we adapt for these variables? So what's the magic here? We have a learning performance within a learning environment. So I can observe somebody's learning performance, and then I can do assessment of various variables that I mentioned, right? So then we have that, and then there's adaptivity happening, and then there's a learning performance change, hopefully, and that's our adaptation cycle, right? It's great. I made that box black for a reason, because most of the time it stays black as a black box, and we don't know what's happening inside. It's the secret sauce that we must not know about. But I want you to know about what I think should happen in there, which is we have a core learning activity you can adapt for, and then we have things around that. Learner support, learning assessment, preparation of learning, or even cross-module progression, which is the macro-level adaptivity. That's nice, still doesn't help me much, right? It's a kind of a model. So we expanded the core learning activity a little bit more and say, what happens within the core learning activity? There's my scaffolds and cues, my feedback and guidance, my modes of representation of information, the rehearsal schedule, how I interact with the environment, what the difficulty progression or the conceptual progression are. Now we're getting somewhere, because now we can say an intelligent tutoring system does difficulty progression and conceptual progression. But does it change the interaction type? Does it change the mode of representation? Not so much. Sometimes, but not so often. We have other things, the learner support, the learning assessment, the preparation of learning, and cross-module progression. And so now we see how the opportunities in the space of adaptation or personalizing learning are actually quite broad. And how, if we mapped what we currently have onto this taxonomy, or beginning of a taxonomy, we would see that just like with the variables we adapt for, what we adapt is actually much narrower than what it could be. So let's look at this in a different way. And the adaptation cycle is something I've been thinking about a lot. Because what happens here, this is the adaptation cycle the way I imagine it, and we start with the source variable. That's the variable that I mentioned that we're looking at as the learner-related variable on which adaptations are based. Could be prior knowledge, could be an affective state, could be the length or level of engagement, student stopped engaging, etc. That's my source variable. I'm observing a variable in the learner, and I'm saying, wait a moment, we need to intervene here. Then I have a learning aim. An aim in the learning process, that's a personalization aim. Something I want to change. That's the element of the learning process that the adaptation targets. Right? For instance, cognitive processes, affective processes, learning outcomes. That can be the same thing as the source. But let's just say I notice in my learning source that there isn't much progress made in learning, and my aim is to support their emotional state or their motivational state, right? So it doesn't have to be the same as the source. It can be a different variable. How do I change the aim? I do that with the personalization target, and the personalization target is what I change in the environment. So it is the element of the learning experience that changes based on the adaptation. Could be the difficulty level, could be learning content, could be the order of learning modules, could be different interactions. So the way how I do that is called the personalization method. The method says I observed a certain source, I want to change something in the learning process, that's my aim. Here's the method on how to do that. And that has to be theory-based or empirically based. And that's where we're currently falling short. We have sources that we can look for. We have aims that we want to address. We have targets in the learning environment because we could change things in the learning environment. And if we tie it all together, if we say this learner is making progress, now all of a sudden they stop making progress, they're showing low levels of motivation and high levels of cognitive load. What theory-based next step would the system recommend? What should change? And that's where we have very, very few models. The only research that really looks into that is at ATI research. Has anybody dealt with ATI research? Kurt has, Bruce has. Most people don't even know what it is anymore. Attribute by treatment interaction research was popular well, it started in the 50s and 60s with Cronbach and Snow. It was popular in the 80s. In the 90s, it faded off, and then by the 2000s, we had forgotten about it because we had measurement problems and replication problems. But what it does is it measures learner variables. It gives two different treatments. It looks at whether one treatment is more effective for one expression of the variable versus another treatment. The only thing that's survived is Carl Jugar's expertise reversal effect. That's like one of the few that we still have. So the personalization method is our bottleneck, timing also the time when the adaptation takes place, even though that's connected to the method. So when we look at this cycle, we now have a place to say, how can we personalize learning with AI? Where are our opportunities here? And that's where I wanted to hear from you again. And I'm going to open up the last two questions here. Are you seeing the next question? Do you think generative AI is mature enough to be used in education settings? Let's look at some of the responses. All right, about 30% are skeptic, 25 to 30%. 17% are like, let's do it. D, somewhat ready, 50%. And 6% are neutral. I'm going to call that healthy skepticism, which is good. Or, skepticism is always good, often healthy. Okay, then let me move on to the next question. With that question in mind, is it mature or is it ready? What are benefits or concerns of using generative AI for learning? Unfortunately, again, one word is easiest for the word cloud, but if you want to do more, you may. What are benefits or concerns? And you have to boil it down to like a thought, not a list, if you would. In other words, what's the top of your list of either benefits, if you're bullish, or concerns, if you were more on the skeptical end of things? All right, we see bias, we see hallucinations, thinking, decline, brainstorming, overvalued. Laziness, critical, deep. Overtrust. So there are lots of different thoughts that you have, and thank you for sharing them. As always, as with the previous questions, I'm going to leave this open so you can respond more, but I'm going to go back to my slides. And I'm going to share these results later with the chair so we can forward them if that's of interest. So often I hear, now that we have chatbots, now that we have conversational agents, the question of personalization of learning has been settled. Here's your agent, go chat, all done. Why not, right? Why bother? We're learning designers now, we have a tool that we can learn with, so let the students ask the agent anything they need to know. Unfortunately, there's research that has shown that if you don't know much, you know how to ask the question. And even if you get engaged by the agent, now you're going into the direction the agent wants you to go. So that might not be the way to go. And so I wanted to think about generative AI for the personalization of learning by relating to the adaptation cycle, by saying, what if we took it in our own hands and said, we can't just leave everything to agent systems, even if it's multiple agents, without thinking very deeply about what that all means. So a chat agent can personalize learning through personalized responses and can, in some cases, identify a knowledge gap and curate instruction, but there are a couple of challenges with it, actually several, but I want to mention just two. One is we're giving up all control to the large language model as learning designers. And as a control freak myself, I'm not really comfortable with that, because that is kind of at the core of what we thought our profession was as learning designers, instructional designers, learning scientists. We thought at the core of our profession was to curate instruction for a learner, and now we're like, hey, you do it. I'm going to go to Thailand, I'm going to go scuba diving. Sounds appealing, but maybe not the right move professionally, and probably not the right move for humanity. So the other reason, though, why I'm really concerned is that when you start personalizing at a level that keeps the learner or gives the learner what they need, you are at great risk of having learners fall behind, because if you don't master the content, you will get a problem at the same level. And if you still don't master it, you will still get the problem at the same level. So while others who master the content accelerate and get new knowledge offered, the learner who, based on the algorithm, still hasn't mastered the knowledge will get the same type of problems and will spend endless hours on the same material. And my own children went through personalized math learning systems, and when I heard screams out of their rooms, it was because they had gotten one problem wrong for whatever reasons, and the system was like, you know what, you're going to get 3 more of those problems. And that's how they started hating personalized learning or adaptive learning in the context, of course, of math worksheets, which is probably the worst thing to personalize in this case. So, how can we do this better? Can we do better? And I want to argue we can do better. How can generative AI support personalization of learning in different ways? And so my first look at what I think that I want to look at is the personalization source. Remember, the personalization source was the learner-related variable or variables that the adaptation is based on. Right? What is the variable we're observing based on which we say we need to intervene? Because if everything goes smoothly, we don't. Right? Something has to happen that we say we want to intervene. What I don't think LLMs currently can do is select that source variable. Because you saw the matrix that I had earlier of all the possible variables, and we haven't done it yet. So if we haven't done it yet, any large language model that ingested the world's knowledge couldn't do it because it hasn't been done yet. Remember, the LLMs don't come up with new information. They're great at combining information that hasn't been combined, but new information is not what it generates because it has a corpus that it deals with, and that's it. So the source variables, there's lack of research, and that means lack of information in the models, and that means not much output, and it requires a learner model because I need to track that information over time, and generic LLMs don't have a learner model. Right? They greet you every time as if it's the new thing. They might have some interactions with you. What they can do, though, and that's very interesting, is support the measurement of those variables. And there's a learning analytics branch that's called multimodal learning analytics, and they're doing a lot of work with measuring learner variables with multimodal sources, meaning various types of inputs. There might be biometric responses, there might be interactions with the system, there might be performance data, and to model learner and learner data that way. That's what the LLMs are actually quite good for, and visualizing that, of course. So the interesting thing is what we need to switch to is a real-time analysis and predictions, and that's what generative AI might actually be very helpful with, but not identifying the variables. Once we have identified them, help us measure and model them. The personalization aim, remember, that's the variable I want to change, so I also have to monitor that. That's typically the learning process. If I don't make enough progress as my source variable, my knowledge doesn't increase. My aim would be to say, either I'm not interested in it, or I'm experiencing high cognitive load, or I'm experiencing certain types of emotions, like I'm frustrated. So the aim would be to change that, right? Similar to the source, I'm not able to actually determine which ones those should be because there's lack of research, but I can measure them. So now we have a really useful way to integrate large language models or generative AI in general into the learning process by measuring the interesting variables and variables of interest and by modeling them. So in other words, learning analytics using AI. Here are some examples. We, in our virtual reality environments, we're tracking everything a learner does by writing log files, and now we can go and visualize that. We can analyze it, we can make certain predictions. If you explore an environment, the way you explore it can help me predict certain variables about you, your exploration strategy knowledge. Do you know, for instance, that when you have a simulation with multiple parameters that you should keep everything constant and change one and observe what's happening, or are you changing all of them, right? So there are things that we know that we can use learning trace data for to analyze that, and that's one way of applying the measurement. And there are many others, of course. The generative AI for the personalization of learning, the target is when it gets interesting. Remember, the target is the changes that I'm making to the environment. And there are many, many, many changes possible. And we need to think about innovative ways of doing that. We need to be more creative than saying, and when the learner asks a question, an intelligent agent will give them a hint or feedback or a cue, all of which is great. Right? But we're essentially copying a good instructor. If we had a one-on-one tutor, we're trying to copy that, right? So feedback and guidance, fine. Different modes of representations. There are some LLMs that do that, but they decide what the representation mode should be based on, we don't know. Right? Would you like to see a visualization of that is a common question. You as a learner need to know whether that's actually something that you would like to see. But often they're asking in such a compelling way that I'm like, I can't say no to that. So yes, I would like to look at a visualization when a table might actually have been a better choice for you. Different interaction types. Have you ever been in an environment where it said, you know, I think we tried this as a simulation, let's switch and make this an animation? I haven't. That would be smart. When would that be smart? If I notice the exploration strategy is not good, if I know their cognitive load is high, and if I know that they're not learning much. Then I'm like, you know what, I'm going to show you an animation of this, not a simulation, or a worked simulation. New content and objects, that's something we're experimenting with, but we have insufficient research as a guidance for when we would say, based on these source variables that I've observed, now I'm going to make this change. And that's, again, the personalization method that we're lacking. But when it comes to the target, what we can't do is the selection of the target. What should we change? That's very hard for the LLM because it requires a learner model which they don't have. But what we can do is we can generate a range of different targets. So if I know what to do, then I can generate that range of targets. And that, again, is super interesting because now we could say, once there is a personalization method that a human has identified or built into the system. Now I can the LLM to say, for instance, here in this dialogue with the virtual agent, we are back to AI-based agents, but here we have a system where we teach, for instance, social workers or counseling students to talk to a patient, right? And where the student uses speech to interact, so now we're using NLP, where the agent responses, now we're using retrieval augmentation to make sure it stays within a certain script, and where the agent can also assess the quality of learner interactions. There are several systems like that. What about item generation? We've worked with item generation in virtual reality when the learner says, I actually want to create a new environment where there's an ocean with dolphins in it, and the system doesn't have dolphins, so let's generate a dolphin, and that already exists. So the user mentioned new content that they want to use to solve a problem. It's not in the system. Our inventory of the system says we don't have it, so we generate it. Right? That is an entirely new opportunity that we have. To generate it is easy. We have the systems now, commercial systems that exist. To say when to generate something and why that is useful or not useful is part of the personalization method, and we don't have that. Right? So we can do it, but we don't know when. We could leave it up to the agent to say, do it now, but then again, we're learning designers. We should have some ideas about that. We have, in our VR learning environments, the AI can observe your progress in problem solving, and after completing a problem, it could give you a new problem. And I don't mean a text problem. I mean a new visual problem in VR to say, hey, you just built a cell. Can you build another cell that has these other types of parameters, this other problem that you need to solve? Right? That's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about personalization. Difficult constructs will be included again. In other words, what you weren't able to do previously, we're now giving you again, and we're adding something new to it. And again, that requires retrieval augmentation. We can change the mode of representation. We've worked with different representations in VR. We have visual, textual, auditory, haptic modes, dimensionality, etc. So there's a lot of things that we could change. And Bruce Homer back there has been doing some work with adding iconic representations to that, so that responds to your either development level or prior knowledge. But there's very little ATI research that would guide the question, when would I change my mode of representation? Same thing for interaction design. Oops. I could do a lot of things for interaction design where I can change my learning mechanic, what we call as the essential interaction within the system, where we have different mechanics implementing different learning approaches. Have we ever seen a system that says, you know, we tried a constructivist learning approach right now where you're supposed to set your own goals and explore. Let's change that. Let's make it direct instruction. That would be something really useful for some learners. And yet, that's not something that we currently do. Because the question is, on what basis would we make that decision? And that's, again, the personalization method. So the method and time, then, is not supported by LLMs at all. The lack of personalization, the selection of the personalization method, including timing, would require a model, a learner model. It would require a content model, and that doesn't currently exist. And so we can't really do that. What we can do is review the available literature, right? We can get some help in saying, hey, what's actually there, and the answer will be very disappointing. So all of that means when we look back at our model, here are a few things we can do. The target creation we can do. Time is a little harder, the method very difficult, and when it comes to source and aim, we can measure them but not identify them. So in other words, we have fragments of where AI can be helpful, and that's something that is, I think, a research agenda that we should all think about. So when we think about the level of AI integration, compared personalization source and personalization target, what I think of as level 1 of AI integration is chat agents, right? We have language exchanges and we get language back, or maybe some visuals. But now we can start measuring the personalization source. I measure one source variable and I get a single mode adaptation. So I measure a variable and maybe the interaction changes, or maybe the visualization changes. Or I have multiple source variables and I change one mode of adaptation. Or I have single source variable multimodal adaptation, or I have it all multimodal. To me, are different levels of adaptations of difficult or complexity of how we use AI to measure one or more variables, to make one or more changes in the system. And from what I think where we are, I don't know where that just went away, is we're barely scratching level 1, right? We're barely scratching level 1 with this, with our personalization right now. That means lots of work to do. So one way to approach that, and I'm going to be very quick about it because we're running up against the end of the hour, is a retrieval-augmented enhanced multi-agent architecture. And essentially what it would need to have as a learner model, it would need to have a knowledge model, a pedagogy model, and a learning systems inventory, meaning what do we already have? And it would look like this. I'm going to go through it. Oh, that's completely disorganized. A number of agents, orchestration agent, learner profile agent, content agent, pedagogy agent, with the right input could start solving this problem. But the challenge with us not knowing what personalization method to use still remains. So that is, to me, a research agenda that we should think about, and that we could all embrace, because we could actually have the AI help us measure the variables, could help us design the new targets for the intervention, etc. And so there's, I think, more than ever an opportunity for research with the support of AI tools that we can do. To me, in other words, the real promise for personalization of learning with AI is on the research and making it better. So this is what I just talked about. I'm not going to summarize it because you just heard it, but I wanted to make one more point. I should have started with that, but what is the role that we want AI to play, right? Do we want to replace human intelligence or augment it? And we all say when asked this question, we need to augment it. I should have made that another survey. Everybody wants to augment it. Because everybody understands that the more we rely on AI, the less we're able to do ourselves. And I want to end with my favorite quote by Joanna Maciejewska. I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do art and writing, not for AI to do my art and writing so I can do my laundry and dishes. And think about when you last used AI, what you used it for. Thank you very much.
We have time for one or two questions. So, and we have Q&A after, and we have a keynote chat in this room for an hour. But does anyone have a pressing question? Want to jump in here? Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? Are you wearing a ring at the moment?
Am I wearing what?
Are you wearing a ring?
My ring?
Is that your wedding ring?
This is my wedding band.
Yeah. And do you have any other rings on your hand?
I don't.
Okay, the reason I'm asking you this question is because some of the things you're mentioning here, and it might interest you, just for indirect inspiration, this over here is what we call an Oura ring. And it tracks your, you have a Whoop band?
I have a Garmin, but we shouldn't really mention brands here. I think they haven't paid up, so we shouldn't mention them.
Yeah. I was going to say Garmin is not the best one to look at.
See, now we can start getting into disagreements.
Well, I'm also in the Garmin ecosystem, so I can compare. The Oura Ring actually has an AI agent in it, and it collects all your data, your HRV, your heart rate, etc. And it has a fairly good AI agent. So if there is issues with your metrics, you will get a particular feedback from it, and then you could get it into a discussion. You could explain to the AI agent, okay, this is the reason why my numbers are lower, and then the AI agent will usually respond with, yeah, okay, that makes sense why you're being like this on this particular day. So why don't you do this? It comes back with a question, or it makes a suggestion. And that's where you, of course, as a human, have to kind of make your own decisions, like, does it make sense for me, and so on. So I can see, like, when you were explaining the different parts of AI and what we should integrate, the physical and the mental aspects are really important too. But
okay. Yep. Do you have a response?
Well, I mean, what you're hinting at is that we have ever increasing quality tools to measure certain biometrics and other variables that could be interesting for your health, for your sleep, for other things, but could also be interesting for learning, right? What if I look at heart rate variability, skin conductance, EEG data, and I could predict your level of cognitive load, your emotional state, etc. So for a learning purpose, it actually is not a future that is too unlikely to say we're all going to have a ring of sorts to measure our biometrics at any given time. And if we choose to share that with the system, which is also, for all the European guests here, they were like, what do you mean sharing? I want to have my data private. But if you choose to share, then we could use that to hopefully enhance your learning experience, with the caveat that for health, I don't want to say it's easy, but there's more data than what we have for learning, right? And so what my main point is to say, even if we had the data, we often would not have a personalization method to even say what to do in response, which in health-related things, we have more data on that.
Elaine, Sam, yes, go ahead.
Well, now that, thank you very much, Jan. I mean, a lot of it is very intuitive, and it was good. The way you put it together, I think, was very interesting. But one of the things that I'm reminded of, and I didn't really want to say it, but I got the chance to say it. What you're talking about is very a rich, technology-rich learning environment, right? AR, VR, intensive, classroom-based. But all learning is not like that, and actually much learning is outside of that equation. So I'm trying to, ask myself, how are these principles going to apply to an open learning environment, a more flexible learning environment, a print-based learning environment, And I think those are some of the things that you might want to reflect on at some other point.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I actually thought quite deeply about what examples should I give and not give. And it all comes down to how we define personalization. So for instance, we have a project which is called STEMXR for Equity, where we design AI tools for teachers and students where they can go out into the field, can record videos on experimentation that they do, come back, and then use the AI tools to analyze the videos. I didn't think that met my criteria for personalization, even though the video, of course, would be personalized, and so they would get something back that responds to their personal data that they've collected. But if we say it needs to watch learner interactions and give the learner what they need at any given time, then it does require mostly a digital ecosystem for the micro-level adaptations. For the meso and macro-level adaptations, we don't. And so there are lots of really interesting examples for using AI in what is kind of personal, more than personalized, that I chose not to include, but there are many, many very interesting examples, and I completely agree we should not think about the use of AI as something that can only happen in fully digital environments. There are lots of opportunities to make it a hybrid environment where a lot happens outside, and then the tools are used for very specific purposes. Thank you for that comment.
And thank all of you for coming this morning. We're on to concurrent sessions. We also have a keynote chat in this room. We should give Dr. Jan Plass a big welcome here. Thank you.